My name's Mike. And as I thought about this question, I guess it's emerging a lot from our own practice on our estate in Bristol. It's about power, and I wanted to just think a bit about this afternoon how I want to draw attention to the way in which power works in everyday lives and how it goes largely unnoticed, but how it has profound effects on everything around us. And I want to refer to this way in which power works as landscapes of power. And I also want to think about how Christian communities are embodied within these landscapes and why it's important that we develop an awareness of them. And I want to do that by telling 5 stories quite briefly. And the first one is about insiders and outsiders, about being people about being either in place or out of place. And it occurs about probably 3 years ago at a prestigious university, I won't say where, and we were in a seminar. I was part of a seminar, about 40 people, and as usual at these things, after an excellent session, we had a coffee break and we all filed out of the room and we walked past a group of 6 cleaners. And as far as I know, as we walked past, there was no real interaction between the people who'd been in the seminar or the cleaners who were gathered around the cleaning trolley outside. And I noticed, in hindsight, that although the seminar was about radical hospitality and was very good from that point of view, that all of us in the room were white middle-class people, and all the cleaners were black African. And yet there was very little engagement, if any, as we walked past them unnoticing. And I reflected on that and thought about what is it about that kind of common everyday experience that for a group of thoughtful people thinking about engaging with others and connecting with people of difference, we could then open the door, go off to our coffee break without even noticing who was out there. Exchanging a word of thanks for cleaning, making no kind of space to engage with each other. There was something about the way things are that kind of made that excusable. That's story number 1. Story number 2 is comes from a friend of ours. We've used this story. It became quite symbolic, really, within our own Christian community on our estate. And this friend she's a grandmother. She's part of our community. And she was coming from the city centre to the estate on a bus, and part way on the journey, a man in a suit and a tie climbs on the bus with his takeout meal, gets on the bus, sits down and gets on with his meal. Bus drives on. A couple of stops later, as bus got near the estate, one of the young man from the estate got on with a hoodie, bag of chips. Bus driver confronted him. "You're not allowed to bring food on this bus. Get rid of the food or get off." Altercation breaks out. Bus driver threatens to call the police. Yeah, there's effing and everything goes on. And chips are thrown all over the bus. Young man gets off. What is it about that situation that allows a man in a suit to get on with his food, but causes the young man in a hoodie to be thrown off? 2 people trying to access the same space, the bus. One is received, the other is excluded. And what's going on through those to cause such different responses to 2 human beings? Story number 2. Story number 3, in Mark 7, as Mark writes his gospel, he tells about how Jesus and his disciples are found by Pharisees and scribes who come to visit from Jerusalem. And they've come to check Jesus out. And they are criticising his disciples in particular because they are not washing their hands before they eat bread. And after some discussion, Jesus rebukes them. You'll know the phrase. And he says, it's not what goes into a person that defiles them, but it's what comes out of a person that defiles them. And then this kind of amazing phrase in brackets, I think, in some versions. Thus, he declared all foods clean. And when Jesus declared all foods clean, he wasn't just talking about food laws. I think that's one of the kind of profound mistakes to make. Oh, he's just talking about the law of the Pharisees. What he was doing was effectively rearranging the map of the world in the way that people thought about the world. So the world that Jesus lived in was cut up and divided up in many kinds of ways, and one of them was around the idea of purity. And there's seven levels of purity, if you like, which depended on the kind of person you were. If you were a male, female, child, Jew, Gentile, person who was had some kind of bodily disease or disability, those kinds of categories, people with leprosy. And so your level of purity would determine where you could go, who you could stand next to, how close you could be to people, which rooms of houses you could be in, how close to the temple you could be, whether you could actually be in the land of Israel. And so the whole world, if you like, was arranged. It was mapped according to your level of purity. And so when Jesus said, he said this to declare all foods clean, he basically redrew the map of the world. And basically said, could catch a phrase, anyone can go anywhere. He just rearranged the way spaces worked in that kind of sense. So the story in Mark informs our imagination about a new kind of space, if you like. Jesus creates, when he says he makes all food clean, he creates a new sense of imagination, a new kind of imagination of a new kind of space, one which I call Jesus space or redemptive space. And the challenge of this space is that we all find within it other kinds of people. In Jesus' day, that would have been people who would have been deemed impure others, people who are different from us. And they all seem to have equal access to this Jesus space. In this story, to be converted or to become a Jesus follower is not just about what we believe, it is suddenly all about who we are prepared to share our spaces with. So it isn't a kind of cognitive thing about believing in Jesus. It's about, when we come to Jesus, realizing that space is crowded with all kinds of other people who make us feel profoundly uncomfortable. It's about who we're prepared to share our spaces with. And we live in an age where spaces are as culturally defined and legally regulated as they have ever been. We can't say, oh, well, that was just Jesus' day. They just did purity stuff then. We don't do that now. We absolutely do it. And just as within Jesus' day, Jesus' disciples and followers wouldn't have seen it. They would have been quite unaware because this is what they were thoroughly enculturated to. It was just how the world worked, just like it was just how the bus worked, or it was just how the university worked. This was just how the spaces worked for Jesus. And so we live in an age where spaces are as culturally defined and legally regulated as they have ever been, whether those spaces are university buildings or buses. How can Christian community be more aware of the ways in which places function and that give advantage to some and exclude others, whether they're buses or university buildings, especially when our own congregations are so divided along these kinds of lines of ethnicity, colour, gender and sexuality? Another story 4. So a young man whose home is on our estate needs to go to the job centre to sign on. He's 19 years old. He's very confident about finding his way around the state. He's respected and held in some awe. But the thought of getting on the bus and signing on is beyond him. He's unable to do that. And so a friend who's the advice centre manager says, I'll come along with you. And so he accompanies this 19-year-old on the bus down to the job centre. When they get to the job centre, his appointment, they find, has been cancelled, having gone through all of that emotional effort. And so my friend says to him, let's go and have a cup of tea in a cafe. They go to a cafe, sit down at the table, have their tea, and this young man gets up, rushes out of the cafe. He's unable to sit in that space. So they go to Tesco Express, get a sandwich, standing in the queue, throws the sandwich away, rushes out the shop. There's something about what is going on in that man's head that makes entering into those spaces very difficult. And this story draws our attention to something important about how places work. That landscapes of power are not only about the external world, it's not just about how the world is socialised out there, they're also internalised, the world in here, the world of our own imaginations. In other words, landscapes of power are not just about how power plays out externally, it is about what goes on inside of us and how those inner imaginings shape our sense of who we are and where we belong, and sometimes more importantly, where we don't belong, as in that case of the young man. Lindsay Handley really articulates this very well in a number of books, but one in a book called Estate, she describes the wall in her head. Now, Lindsay Handley is somebody who's grown up on an estate, she's become an anthropologist and journalist. And she says, as somebody who has grown up on an estate, she describes a wall in her head that prevents her getting involved in places and with people that are outside of the estate. Places where she does not feel she belongs. She says, all of us have a wall in our heads, but for most middle-class people, they are only knee-high, easy to step over. And he says that for many estate people, the wall in their heads are so high they can't see over them. And this draws our attention to the powerful way that our own inner worlds affect the ways we see the world and find our way around it. It begins to show us how unaware we are about our own view of the world and how that is so different from those of other people around us. In other words, the way I see the world and the things I take for granted are by no means shared by the vast majority of other people. I think it's a very challenging thing to try and come to terms with, that my perspective about how the world works and who I am and who you are within that world are not shared perspectives. They're very different from others. So, just to conclude, how does this help us to think as Christian communities about the ways in which we are present in the world? If we want to pursue Christian living in a way that is contextually sensitive or so-called incarnational, then we need to pay particular attention, I suggest, to a number of areas. Number one, that following Jesus must involve open-hearted encounters with people who are not like me. Following Jesus must involve open-hearted encounters with people who are not like me, and that through such encounters I will not only learn about their world, but they will also help me to see things about my world that I had not that had been previously hidden from me. Secondly, that following Jesus means participating in the formation of new Jesus-centered spaces or redemptive spaces that are radically hospitable. Thirdly, that following Jesus means a willingness to confess my own collaboration in the ways of living that my own collaboration in ways of living that exclude some people and keep them at a disadvantage or a distance from myself. So it's about how I collaborate in the formation of spaces like in that bus that exclude people. And that the journey of mission, fourthly, is as much a journey into my own self, my own inner landscapes, as it is a journey into places and cultures around me. There are a lot of implications for us if we walk this road, and this, I hope, is the space that urban life, in part at least, is beginning to explore. I had so one of the ways, just in terms of Jesus space, I'll just finish with, because I forgot to say it just now, is that I find this kind of helpful when we think about the way space is normally arranged, is arranged hierarchically, and often we think about space as maintaining our position and our identity or climbing the ladder. And in this kind of model of space, you've got a few privileged people who benefit from the ways that most are disadvantaged, those who are excluded. I think we can think about a simple transition in Jesus space to a circle with Jesus in the centre, which is a collaborative, mutual space where all gather it's not hierarchical. Power works very differently in this kind of space to that kind of space. Bit simplistic, but I think it's a helpful, simple model for us to imagine how we might participate in the creation of new kinds of spaces. It's quite a radical shift from one to the other. And that is my presentation for you folks this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you.